All right, let's get right into it. We hear about crimes and punishments all the time, but do you ever stop and wonder about the why behind it all? What's the actual logic the law uses to decide if something is a crime in the first place? Today, we're going to take a journey through the absolute core of criminal justice, and we'll use India's new code, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, as our roadmap.
You know, it really all boils down to one huge question. Think about it. What's the real difference between a tragic accident and a punishable crime? If a car hits a patch of black ice and skids, is that the same thing as someone who just decides to blow through a red light? Well, the law says not exactly. And the answer is found in two essential ingredients it's always looking for.
The first, and you could argue the most important of these ingredients, is something called mens rea. Now that's Latin, and it literally means the guilty mind. And this isn't about feeling guilty. It's about the mental element. Did you intend to do it? Did you know that what you were doing could cause harm? The law has to see some kind of criminal intention or knowledge behind the act itself.
This old legal saying really gets to the heart of it. It's the absolute bedrock of modern criminal law. It basically says an act doesn't make you guilty unless your mind is also guilty. The action and the intention, they have to go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other.
And what's so fascinating is just how specific the law gets about what's going on inside your head. Just look at these two words, dishonestly and fraudulently. I mean, they sound pretty similar, don't they? But in the eyes of the law, they are worlds apart. Acting dishonestly is all about causing a specific financial gain or loss. But acting fraudulently is much broader. It's about a general plan to deceive someone. That tiny difference in your mindset can literally define a completely different crime.
So, if mens rea is the guilty mind, then the second key ingredient is actus reus, the guilty act. This is the physical part of the crime. It's the thing you actually do. And get this, it can also be something you fail to do. If you have a legal duty to act, like a lifeguard on duty, and you don't, well, that inaction itself can be the guilty act.
Okay, so we've got our two main ingredients, a guilty mind and a guilty act. Seems straightforward enough, right? But what happens when things get more complicated? What happens when a crime isn't committed by one person, but by a whole group? How does the law figure out who's to blame then?
Well, this is where a really powerful idea called common intention comes into play. Under the BNS, if a bunch of people have a shared plan to commit a crime and then an act is done to move that plan forward, every single person in that group is just as guilty as the one who actually did the final act. Just being part of the plan makes you responsible for the crime itself.
And the test for this is pretty logical. First, the court has to find that there was a pre-arranged plan, what they call a meeting of the minds. It doesn't have to be some elaborate scheme written down, just a shared understanding. Second, the criminal act itself had to be done to help that plan succeed. If both of those things are proven, well, then everyone involved is on the hook.
So we have the mind, the act, and what happens in a group. But here comes the plot twist. The law has these built-in exceptions, scenarios where something that looks for all the world like a crime is actually legally excused. Let's check out a few of these.
Okay, picture this absolutely terrifying scenario. A person, let's call them A, is literally being dragged away by a tiger. Their friend B grabs a rifle and fires at the tiger to save them, knowing full well that the shot is risky and might hit A. And tragically, it does. A is killed by the bullet.
So let's think about this. B's action directly caused A's death. There's no doubt about that. So the big question is, has B committed a crime?
And the answer is no. This is a classic example of what's called the principle of necessity. The law recognizes that B had no criminal intent here. They acted in good faith to prevent a much greater and, frankly, more certain harm, which was A being killed by the tiger. The act was necessary, so B has committed no offense.
All right, let's look at another really tough case. A surgeon, acting in what they believe is the patient's best interest, has to deliver the terrible news that the patient cannot survive their illness. The patient is so overwhelmed by the shock that they pass away. The surgeon's words were the direct cause of this tragedy. So you have to ask, is the surgeon legally responsible for what happened? And again, the law says no. This is protected by an exception called good faith communication. Because the surgeon was communicating for the patient's benefit, to allow them to prepare, for instance, and not with any malice, they aren't held liable, even for this awful outcome. The intent is everything here.
And for our last scenario, Imagine a court officer has a warrant to arrest a person named Y. The officer does their homework, investigates, and becomes convinced that another person, Z, is actually Y. So they go ahead and arrest Z. They've arrested the wrong person.
So, has this officer, by arresting and confining an innocent person, committed a crime? It certainly seems like it on the surface. But the law actually protects him. This falls under the exception for a mistake of fact. See, the officer wasn't mistaken about the law. He knew he was legally required to make an arrest. He was mistaken about a fact, the identity of the person. And because he acted in good faith, believing he was just doing his duty, he's not guilty.
The price of crime. Okay, so we've seen what makes a crime, and we've seen what doesn't. But what happens when an act is a crime with no excuses and no exceptions?
The Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita lays out 6 types of punishments. You've got the ones you'd expect, like fines, taking away property, and of course, imprisonment, which can be simple or rigorous, meaning with hard labor. Then you have life in prison and the death penalty. But look at that last one, community service. That's a new and pretty modern addition to the whole framework.
Now, the ultimate penalty, death, is not something the courts use lightly. It's strictly reserved for what they call the rarest of rare cases, situations so shocking that life in prison just isn't considered enough. And the language the law uses is just as stark and final as the punishment itself.
And that really leaves us with the fundamental question at the core of any justice system. When you look at the whole picture, the logic of intent, the physical act, and all those gray areas and exceptions in between, it all comes down to a balancing act. When should the law forgive an honest mistake or an act of necessity? And when must it enforce its toughest consequences? That is the question at the very heart of the law.